You really have to hear what this team encountered. 3 people did not come back out of Wisconsin's Nicolet National Forest alive on July 18, 2012, and the one man who did has spent 14 years trying to make the facts sound ordinary. They never do. Deputies found one body with no tears, no bite marks, no water in the lungs, and no damage a medical examiner could name with confidence. The first report called it exposure complicated by panic. That report was wrong before the ink dried. What comes next is the account. My name is Daniel Keshena. I was 41 that summer, and I had spent 13 years working as a cultural field researcher in northern Wisconsin, documenting burial sites, logging scars, old trail corridors, and the places families kept naming in the same low voice. My mother's people were Menominee. My grandfather trapped along the Wolf River and hunted north into country that later got boxed and signed by other men. Nothing had ever frightened me. That changed at Nicolet National Forest. The trip looked ordinary on paper. A storm line had gone through the eastern side of the forest 2 weeks earlier and rolled up root plates in a section of low timber near the Whisker Lake Wilderness. Not far from old logging traces and an unrecorded rise one of our tribal monitors wanted checked before amateur diggers reached it. The Forest Service wanted a quick survey before trail crews moved farther in. We had permits, maps, radios, 1 satellite phone, 2 trail cameras, fresh batteries, and enough food for 3 nights. The nearest dependable help was 21 miles away. There were 4 of us. I handled the site notes and cultural review. Mark Holland was 56, a Forest Service law enforcement officer with 28 years in the Northwoods, broad-shouldered, patient, and certain that any problem with tracks behind it could be reasoned through. Lena Ortiz was 33, an audio documentarian with 9 years in field recording, the kind of woman who smiled when equipment failed because she liked fixing things other people had already cursed at. Eli Mercer was 24, a graduate assistant from Madison with 1 year of real field time and the habit of walking a few steps ahead of everyone else. We staged out of Wabeno and hiked in under light rain. The place we were going sat in low black spruce and cedar, where the ground changed character every 20 yards and what looked solid could bend under your weight. Peat held water under the roots. Whole mats of earth floated over dark pockets you could punch through with 1 bad step. Even in daylight, the woods had a muffled quality, as if the ground was taking in sound and keeping it. The first wrong thing happened before camp was up. Lena had gone 30 yards west to catch room tone under the cedars. She came back without speaking and handed me her headphones. I listened for wind, drip, and insects. Instead, I heard 30 seconds of normal forest, then a sharp drop into nothing. Not quiet, nothing. The tape kept rolling, but every living sound disappeared as if a door had closed over the whole place. At the end of that blank stretch, something moved under the microphone. Not on leaves. Under them. Mark said it was moisture interference. Eli said maybe a deer had stepped into standing water. Lena pointed toward a line of prints in black mud, narrow heel, high arch, 5 clear toes, walking north. We followed them across 10 feet of open ground and watched them end in the middle of a stride. No turn, no slide, no second trail. Just 1 last print pressed into the muck and nothing beyond it except unbroken moss. We made camp on the 1 raised strip we could trust, a former logging spur just wide enough for 2 tents and a fire pan. Before dusk, Eli walked south to hang a food bag and called for us in a voice that tried to sound amused. We found him standing over a pair of children's rubber boots, blue, clean, and set neatly side by side on a hummock where no child had reason to be. Beside them lay a yellow rain jacket folded into a square. Mark photographed the items and bagged them. He said a family could have come through from a dispersed site. He said that while looking at the distance to the nearest family campground. That night, the forest lost its small sounds at 9:14 p.m. Frogs cut off first. Then the insects. Then even the drizzle on cedar leaves seemed to move farther away without stopping. At 9:21, the satellite phone lit up with a call screen and no number. There was no ring, only light. The screen flickered, went black, and came back with a recording timer running by itself. From the speaker came a man's voice saying my name. It was my older brother's voice. He had been dead since 2008. I did not answer. My grandmother had told me when I was a boy that wet ground sometimes learned the shape of a voice. If it called from timber after sunset, You did not return the name it used. You lowered your eyes. You kept both feet on the same piece of earth. You waited for morning or died tired. I had not thought of that warning in years. Hearing my brother's voice on a dead screen brought it back whole. Eli stood before either of us could stop him. He said it had to be interference. He took 2 steps beyond the firelight and said, very softly, "Hello." Everything after that moved too cleanly. No thrashing. No cry cut short. The darkness beyond the spruce line compressed, as if a section of night had leaned inward. Lena's recorder clipped with a low-pressure sound that rattled my teeth. Eli's headlamp bobbed once at chest height, then dropped to the ground and stayed there. When we reached the spot, the lamp was lit, his pack was on its side, and his boots stood together in the mud as if he had removed them to enter someone's house. His tracks came from camp to the lamp. They ended mid-stride exactly where the moss changed color. Mark kept us working because work leaves less room for thought. He marked a perimeter, loaded the shotgun from the truck cache we had carried in for bears, checked our radio batteries, and set the trail cameras chest high facing the only open approaches. We searched until 1:30 in the morning. Nothing. At dawn we found one more thing. Eli's field notebook lay under a cedar root 20 yards from camp, dry despite the wet ground. On the final page, written in his hand but with none of his usual slant, were 5 words. "IT knows who is listening. We should have left then. We did not." Mark said a missing person search needed daylight and discipline. By noon he had raised dispatch on the radio, but the transmission tore apart every time he spoke our coordinates. Dispatch heard pieces. For persons. 1 missing. Possible exposure. Then static. We packed for withdrawal anyway. The second wrong thing happened in daylight. We found a deer on the edge of a steep pool with no visible wound. Stiff on its side. Eyes open. Body untouched by scavengers. Mark rolled it with a stick and told us to look at the legs. The muscles had gone slack in a way I had only seen long after death, yet the body was still warm at the core. No blood at the nose. No foam. No fracture. Just an animal emptied of force. Lena kept recording because recording gave her hands a job. At 3:17 that afternoon she caught a sound none of us heard live. Later, when I listened back, it came through the left channel under the wind. A breath drawn through wet reeds, then a sentence in Menominee spoken by a woman so old her words cracked on the consonants. "Come lower, grandson." The thing used a language Eli did not know and Mark could not have invented. It was learning from us as we stood there. Night 2 began with order. Mark put the fire higher, kept the gun across his knees, and made each of us repeat the plan. No one moved alone. No one answered any voice from the trees. By then our batteries had dropped by half for no reason we could explain. The cameras ate through fresh cells in 40 minutes. Lena's best recorder shut down at 92% charge and came back showing an empty card. At 10:03 the silence came again. At 10:06 something moved around us just beyond the light, not crushing brush but pressing the saturated ground from beneath. You could see it in the shallow rise moving through puddles, a traveling hump where no body showed above the surface. It circled once clockwise, once counterclockwise. Then Mark heard a woman crying from the south tree line and made the error of believing a problem could still be solved by reaching it first. I saw only part of what took him. A shape passed between 2 cedar trunks, taller than Mark by a full head, with a stride that covered 4 feet of ground at a time and shoulders too narrow for its height. The surface of it looked wrong, less like skin than soaked bark peeled and laid back down. Mark raised the shotgun and fired once. The blast lit a face only in pieces. One side ridged, the other smooth and dark as water under roots. Then the forest dropped silent so hard my ears rang. Mark did not fall the way struck men fall. He folded where he stood and sat down against a stump as if his legs had been removed from the decision. His eyes were open. His mouth was open. There was no blood. When I reached him, the skin under his jaw felt cold, but his chest still held a little heat. He died looking straight ahead at something Lena and I could not see. We left the camp then. There was no holding ground after that. Lena carried 1 recorder and the satellite phone. I took Mark's map case, our remaining water, and the cedar packet my grandmother had given me years before for burial work. Tobacco wrapped in cloth with a strip of paper tied around it. She had written one line in English because she knew I was more likely to obey if I could read it plainly. If the old one speaks from under the roots, feed the ground and do not look for the taken. We were a mile from the spur road when Lena heard her younger brother calling for help. He had drowned at 16 in Arizona. She stopped walking and turned her head toward the black timber on our left with the listening look people get when the dead arrive in memory before they arrive in sound. I opened the cedar packet, dropped the tobacco into the water at my boots, and told her not to answer. The voice came again, closer now, and this time it used the private name her family had used for her as a child. She looked at me once. I still think she wanted me to tell her it was impossible. Then the ground beside her gave a slow breath. The moss lifted under her right boot. She screamed one word, not his name, mine, and the dark between the cedars leaned open. I saw her only in fragments after that. Her flashlight spinning, one hand clawing at fern roots, her recorder wire pulled tight across a stump. Her boots left behind one after the other as if the earth were undressing her for itself. I lunged once and caught canvas. The strap ripped in my hand. There was no body to pull against. Only force moving down and away. Then she was gone. I walked out at first light with no boots, no pack frame, and Mark's map case under my coat. Deputies found me on the logging road at 6:40 in the morning. We led them back to the site. They recovered Mark where I had left him. They found Lena's recorder in standing water and Eli's headlamp beside the old fire pan. They did not find Eli. They did not find Lena. They found 2 pairs of boots placed neatly beside one another and wrote that detail down as if it belonged in a normal report. The medical examiner in Forest County ruled that Mark Holland had no cardiac disease sufficient to explain death, no stroke, no embolism, no drowning, no electrical injury, no toxic exposure, and no trauma severe enough to stop a healthy man that fast. The language in the file bent around the gap. Probable environmental stress. Possible arrhythmia. Unwitnessed precipitating event. He told me in person that bodies do not usually look drained. That was the word he used once, before he asked me not to repeat it. The official report kept the safer shape. 1 young man missing after disorientation. 1 woman presumed drowned in bog conditions. 1 law officer dead after stress in a difficult extraction environment. Equipment failure due to moisture. Statements affected by fatigue. No sign of criminal activity. But moisture does not place boots side by side. Fatigue does not end tracks in the middle of a stride. Bog water does not take 2 adults without breaking a line of moss. For a year I tried to live as if the paperwork had more weight than what I saw. I slept on the floor because beds put me too high off the ground. I never left shoes beside the door. I kept them under a chair where I could see both of them at once. Anytime rain tapped at the window after dark, I checked the lock 3 times before turning out the kitchen light. Once, in late October, a neighbor knocked after midnight because rainwater was leaking through the ceiling in the hall. I heard his voice through the door and still made him slide his driver's license under the frame before I opened it. He laughed when I checked the chain twice. I waited until sunrise to pick up the wet shoes I had left outside and sat at the kitchen table in silence. Then I started reading. In a ranger station archive outside Rhinelander, I found a 1974 incident memo from a seasonal worker who reported hearing his mother calling from a cedar swamp in the Nicolet. His partner was found dead with no major injury. In county records from 1989, a bow hunter near Leona left behind folded clothes and was never recovered. In 1997, 2 mushroom pickers reported a patch of forest going silent before one of them lost 6 hours and came home without his boots. In each case, the survivor developed exhaustion, chest pain, and a failing heart within the next decade. 3 died younger than their fathers. I took those papers to my mother's uncle, Joseph Keshena, in Nicolet. He was 82 then, with a habit of wading through other people's last sentence before deciding whether it deserved an answer. He read every page. Then he brought me a birch bark envelope that had belonged to my grandmother. Inside was a small strip of red cloth, 2 grains of wild rice, and a note in her hand. Joseph told me the old people had a name for what stayed in the wet timber under the Nicolet. He said it once only. Patakosu, the one who waits beneath the roots. He told me it does not begin by taking flesh. Take strength, rhythm, breath, the hidden clock in the chest. That is why some of the taken are found whole and some are not found at all. That is why men who walk away can still die years later with their hearts giving out for reasons doctors cannot put together. Joseph said the rule was simple and cruel. If it calls in a beloved voice, you do not answer. If the ground starts breathing, you feed it tobacco or rice and keep your eyes lowered until dawn. If it has chosen another person, you do not go after them. That is how it keeps a second body. I asked him if the rule saved me. He folded my grandmother's note and put it back into the birch bark. Partly, he said. The rest is that it did not want you that night. I survived because it let me. Nicolet National Forest is still open to the public today. Families camp there. Hunters move through in November. Anglers put in at the lakes and come home with photographs of clean water and bright fish and kids smiling beside canoes. Most people who pass under those trees will have an ordinary day, and I hope they do. But on warm, wet nights after heavy rain, in the low cedar ground where the moss floats over black water and the insects go silent all at once, the pattern begins again and nobody links the cases because each one is filed under a different kind of loss. Missing hiker, medical event, exposure, accident. The hidden part stays hidden because the forest gives officials enough facts to close a folder and never enough to force it open again. If you ever hear a voice you love coming from dark timber in that part of Wisconsin after sunset, do not answer it, and do not go looking for the person it sounds like. Keep your eyes on the ground. Keep your name in your mouth. Walk only when morning comes. I survived because I obeyed the only rule my grandmother left me. That is the part that keeps me awake at night.